February 1945. A frozen road intersection near Bitberg, Germany. A muddy jeep idles at the edge of a crossroad while a German shepherd sits perfectly still in the slush. The dog refuses to move. His ears are pinned back, and his tail is tucked. He is signaling a hidden death beneath the gravel. A young corporal holds the leash tight, his face pale as he warns the officers behind him to stop the column. A captain steps forward, looking at his watch and then at the animal with a sneer of pure disgust. He sees a delay in his schedule. He sees a superstitious gimmick. He orders the vehicles to drive straight through the warning. The explosion that follows will tear the winter air apart and leave 2 men dead in the burning wreckage. George S. Patton is about to show this captain exactly why some instincts are more disciplined than a silver bar. This is the story of what happened when ego outranked experience and a commander's arrogance led his men directly into a buried trap. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show what happened when old hierarchies met new realities. By following the channel, you help us preserve these accounts of the moments that forced people to face exactly what they had done. Corporal Peter Johansson was 23 years old and hailed from the rugged, windswept shores of Duluth, Minnesota. Before the war, he had worked alongside his father in the timber yards, a job that required a quiet patience and a deep understanding of the working animals that hauled the heavy loads through the snow. He had enlisted after his younger brother was lost at sea, carrying a heavy sense of responsibility that made him one of the most meticulous handlers in the K9 mine detection program. For 14 months, Peter had been inseparable from Rex, a German shepherd with a sharp gaze and an even sharper nose. Together, they had navigated the treacherous mud of Italy and the dense forests of France. Rex was more than a tool to Peter. He was a partner who had saved dozens of lives by identifying 11 different minefields without a single error. Peter trusted the dog's silence more than he trusted any map, knowing that when Rex sat down, the ground ahead was no longer earth, but a graveyard waiting to happen. Captain Russell Troy was 31 years old, a man from San Antonio, Texas, who carried himself with the rigid, unearned posture of someone who believed his rank was a birthright rather than a responsibility. Coming from a family with a long line of military officers, Troy viewed the chaos of the European theater through the narrow lens of charts, schedules, and traditional doctrine. To him, the K9 program was nothing more than a desperate gimmick thought up by bureaucrats who had never smelled gunpowder. He took a perverse pride in his skepticism, often mocking the handlers as mere dog walkers who were clogging up his supply lines. Troy's boots were always polished to a mirror shine, even in the slush of Bitberg, and he wore a tailored wool overcoat that stood out against the grime of the front line. He had ignored mine dog alerts twice before during the advance, and because luck had been on his side those times, his contempt had hardened into a dangerous certainty. He believed that the only thing that moved an army was a commanding officer's will, not the whims of an animal sitting in the mud. By February 1945, the German border was no longer a distant line on a map. It was a reality of jagged concrete teeth and frozen blood. The Allied machine was grinding through the Rhineland, pushing toward the heart of the Reich, but the retreating Wehrmacht was leaving a lethal inheritance in its wake. Every bridge was blown, every cellar was a potential nest for snipers. Most terrifying of all was the hidden war beneath the soil. The German pioneers had become masters of the Devil's Garden, planting thousands of wooden shoe mines and steel S-mines that could bypass standard metal detectors. The advance was a stop-and-go nightmare where a single wrong step could stall an entire division. In this atmosphere of frantic movement, the pressure on company commanders was immense. The high command demanded speed to prevent the enemy from reforming their lines. Locke dictated that every minute spent sweeping a road was a minute given to the Germans to zero in their heavy artillery. Because of this, many officers viewed the K9 mine detection units with a mixture of suspicion and impatience. These dogs were a new addition to the theater, and to a traditional officer corps raised on ballistics and bayonets. Relying on a K9's nose felt like a return to medieval sorcery. Lower-level officers often let their personal biases dictate the safety of their men. If a commander was in a hurry, the slow, methodical pace of a dog handler was the first thing to be sacrificed. In the race to the Rhine, caution was often branded as cowardice, and the specialized warnings of the K9 teams were frequently brushed aside in favor of keeping the wheels turning. The intersection near Bitberg was just one small point on a vast front, but it was about to become a monument to the cost of that impatience. The stage was set for a collision between a captain's pride and a corporal's warning. Corporal Johansson held the leather lead tight, his knuckles white against the cold. Rex remained frozen, his belly nearly touching the slush, a silent statue of warning. Captain Troy walked to the front of the column, his boots splashing through the mud. He didn't look at the dog. He looked at his watch. He told the corporal to move his animal, because they were already 10 minutes behind the march table. Johansson shook his head and said that the dog wouldn't budge for a reason. He explained that Rex had alerted on this exact spot and that there were mines under the gravel. Troy laughed, a short and dry sound, and said he wasn't stopping a reinforced company because a pet got cold feet. The corporal stepped into the center of the road, physically blocking the path of the lead jeep. He begged the captain to listen, stating that the dog had never been wrong and that the intersection was a death trap. Troy's face turned a deep shade of red. He stepped close to Johansson, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. He told the corporal that he took his orders from the United States Army chain of command, not from a German shepherd. He called the K9 program a circus act for dog walkers who were too soft for real infantry work. Johansson tried to speak again, but Troy cut him off, shouting for him to get that mutt off his road or he'd have them both arrested for obstructing a combat operation. The corporal looked at the men in the lead jeep, his eyes pleading, but they looked away. They followed orders. Troy waved the driver forward. He said that a dog sitting down wasn't intelligence, it was animal behavior, and his schedule didn't account for nature walks. As the corporal pulled Rex into the ditch, the lead jeep's tires rolled onto the intersection. The explosion was instantaneous. A fountain of black earth and jagged metal erupted into the sky. The force of the blast flipped the quarter-ton vehicle like a toy, throwing the occupants into the freezing air. When the smoke cleared, the screams of the wounded were the only sound. 2 men lay motionless in the mud, killed instantly by the anti-tank mine. The engineers were called forward, and over the next 3 hours, they pulled 17 more mines from the very spot where Rex had sat. Every single one was live. Every single one was positioned to kill. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. The roar of a multi-tone horn cut through the sound of shovels hitting gravel as engineers worked to clear the remaining mines. His jeep skidded to a halt near the blackened crater, the 4 silver stars on his helmet gleaming even under the overcast sky. He stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped, his ivory-handled revolvers catching the dim light. He did not yell. He did not wave his arms. He simply stood there, a silent force of nature, looking at the dead men being wrapped in olive-drab blankets and then at the dog sitting quietly by the ditch. Captain Troy snapped to a rigid salute, his face pale but his jaw set. Patton ignored the salute. He looked Troy in the eye and asked how many mines the engineers had found. Troy cleared his throat and said 17, General. Patton asked how many times the dog had signaled an alert before today. Troy hesitated, then admitted the handler claimed 11 successful detections. Patton leaned in closer, his voice a low, raspy velvet that made the surrounding soldiers go still. He asked if Troy believed himself to be a better judge of German engineering than a creature specifically bred and trained to smell it. Troy stammered that he could not base tactical decisions on animal behavior, and that his schedule was primary. Patton took a slow step forward, forcing Troy to back up against the fender of a truck. He told the captain that he had spent his entire life studying the art of war, and in all those years, he had never met a man as dangerously stupid as an officer who mistook arrogance for leadership. He pointed at Rex and said that the animal had a better mine detection record than Troy's entire company. 11 out of 11 was not a gimmick. It was a perfect score. Patton asked what Troy's record was today. 2 dead Americans and a destroyed jeep because a captain thought his silver bars gave him the nose of a bloodhound. He told Troy that mine detection was about saving lives, not satisfying a schedule. He did not care if the warning came from a sophisticated metal detector, a combat engineer, or a stray mutt from the streets of Berlin. If the dog sits, you stop. That was the law of the Third Army from this moment forward. He looked at the dead soldiers and then back at Troy. He told the captain that he was relieved of command effective immediately. He said Troy wasn't fit to lead men because he didn't respect the tools meant to keep them alive. He gave Troy a simple choice. He could go back to the rear and face a court-martial for gross negligence, or he could grab a bayonet and join the engineers on his hands and knees to clear the rest of the road. Troy chose the bayonet. He did not look up again. The order was carried out immediately, before the eyes of the entire stalled column. Captain Troy was stripped of his polished wool overcoat and his sidearm, standing in his shirt sleeves in the biting February wind. An engineer sergeant handed him a standard-issue bayonet and a pair of heavy gloves. Under the watchful, icy gaze of General Patton, the former company commander was forced to drop to his knees in the freezing slush. He began the grueling process of prodding the earth, inch by agonizing inch. Along the secondary path of the intersection, the mud seeped through his trousers and the cold numbed his fingers. But every time he slowed, the silent presence of the general in the nearby jeep acted as a goad. The soldiers he had commanded watched from their vehicles in a heavy, contemplative silence. They saw the man who had traded 2 lives for a schedule now tasting the very dirt that held the threat he had dismissed. The air was thick with the scent of wet wool, exhaust, and the metallic tang of the excavated mines. Every time Troy's blade clinked against stone, he flinched, the weight of his error pressing down harder than the winter sky. By the time he reached the far side of the road, he was covered in the filth of the earth, a broken man who finally understood the gravity of the dirt. Corporal Peter Johansson returned to Duluth after the war. He lived a quiet life, rarely speaking of the muddy roads of Bitberg, though neighbors noted he never went anywhere without a dog by his side. He spent 40 years working for the Minnesota Forestry Service, a man who moved slowly and watched the ground with a practiced, careful eye. He passed away in 1988, leaving behind a collection of small, hand-carved wooden figures of German shepherds. Rex lived out his final years on Peter's porch, eventually buried in a place of honor beneath a massive oak tree, a bronze commendation medal tucked into the soil beside him. Captain Russell Troy was never given another command. After the road was cleared, he was transferred to a desk position in a logistics depot far from the front lines. He returned to San Antonio in 1946, but the arrogance that had once defined him was gone, replaced by a hollow, jittery silence. He never resumed his place in the family social circles and died of a heart ailment in 1964. Those who knew him said he could never pass a construction site or a patch of freshly turned earth without flinching. The 17 mines he had tried to ignore remained the only numbers that mattered for the rest of his life. Patton never officially recorded the incident in his personal diaries, though he kept a copy of the Third Army Directive on K-9 authority in his field desk until his death. He once told a junior officer that a commander's greatest sin was not a lack of courage, but a lack of humility in the face of the truth. To Patton, the dog was simply a soldier who didn't lie, and he had no patience for officers who were less honest than a hound. He believed that the ground always told the truth, regardless of who was reading it. Some historians argue that Patton's decision was an act of performative theater designed to humiliate an officer rather than follow military law. They suggest that relieving a company commander on the spot over a K-9 alert bypassed the standard due process of the Judge-Advocate General's Corps. However, other scholars point to the staggering casualty rates caused by German mines during the final months of the war as a justification for such drastic measures. They argue that Patton's decisive action was a necessary evolution in modern warfare that saved thousands of lives by validating new technology. What is certain is that the Third Army's K-9 policy became the gold standard for mine detection during the occupation of Germany. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same, or would you have simply issued a private reprimand? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about what happened when ego outranked experience, make sure you subscribe.